Tonight's briefing begins with a question that ties several seemingly separate stories together. What happens when military pressure, economic coercion, alliance politics, and great power rivalry all intensify at the same time? Across the Middle East, Europe, East Asia, and the global energy market, the answer appears to be the same. States are testing each other's limits while trying to avoid the full cost of open escalation. Let me walk you through that carefully, because the pattern matters more than any single headline. In Washington, the Trump administration is reportedly weighing new military options against Iran, even after a ceasefire. In Tehran, authorities are said to be racing to recover buried missiles and munitions. In Europe, the White House is signaling that troop deployments may now be treated as political leverage. And in Beijing, a fresh dispute over supply chains is unfolding just ahead of another high-level summit. According to reporting cited by Iran International, senior American military officials, including the commander of United States Central Command, General Brad Cooper, presented President Donald Trump with new military options related to possible action against the Islamic Republic of Iran. The discussion reportedly took place on Thursday and included the latest force movements and deployments across the Middle East. That alone is significant because it suggests that contingency planning has not slowed after the recent phase of fighting. Three principal options were reportedly placed on the table. The first involved deploying American ground forces to small islands around the Strait of Hormuz in order to reopen and secure that strategic waterway. The second involved sending special operations forces into the Isfahan area to seize Iran's stockpile of uranium, enriched to roughly 60%. The third involved rapid but forceful American strikes against targets inside Iran. Each of those options carries a different strategic logic. A move around the Strait of Hormuz would focus on maritime access and deterrence, with the immediate objective of preserving freedom of navigation through one of the world's most sensitive energy choke points. A raid toward Isfahan would be narrower but far riskier because it would move from signaling into direct intervention against material associated with Iran's nuclear program. A rapid strike option, by contrast, would maximize speed and shock, but it would also raise the danger of retaliation across the region. That is the core mechanism here. Washington appears to be examining not one war plan, but three different theories of coercion. Reopen the sea lane, remove the sensitive material, or punish the regime fast enough to alter its calculus. Those are not the same thing, and the differences matter. And one is about geography, one is about nuclear latency, and one is about escalation dominance. A senator identified in the report said after briefings that military action against Iran remained under consideration and that the possibility of a strike was still high. Around the same time, United States Central Command published images of American air crews preparing aircraft for operations at a base in the Middle East. In a statement posted on social media, the command said that F-16 fighter aircraft continue to conduct routine patrols across the region in support of security and stability. That public messaging is worth noting. Routine patrols can, in fact, be routine, but they can also serve as visible reminders that operational options remain active, aircraft remain armed, and command networks remain in place. In crises like this, images of flight crews and combat aircraft are not just documentation. They are signaling. Now stay with me, because the second development helps explain why a ceasefire has not produced real strategic calm. According to NBC, citing American officials and people familiar with the matter, Iran is accelerating efforts to recover missiles and ammunition that were buried, concealed underground, or trapped beneath rubble during weeks of American and Israeli strikes. The timing is important. These efforts are reportedly taking place during a fragile ceasefire, not after a durable settlement. So, American officials believe Tehran is trying to restore at least part of its missile and drone capability in case diplomacy breaks down and fighting resumes. Even after large-scale attacks on launch sites and production facilities, Iran is believed to have preserved a portion of its arsenal by dispersing and hiding weapons before and during the conflict. That is a classic lesson in asymmetric military survival. If you cannot match your opponent aircraft for aircraft, you preserve striking power through dispersion, concealment, and redundancy. This does not mean Iran escaped major damage. It means the damage may not have been total. And that distinction is critical because the political narrative after a strike campaign often claims a level of finality that the operational reality does not support. Buried stockpiles, hidden launchers, and fragmented supply networks can allow a state to regenerate limited capabilities faster than outside observers expect. And that is why ceasefires in this kind of confrontation can be deceptive. On the surface, the guns fall quiet. Underneath, both sides reposition, rearm, and test the credibility of the pause. A ceasefire without trust, verification, or a political path forward is not peace. It is often just a countdown measured in logistics. The economic dimension is tightening at the same time. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said on Thursday, April 30th, that Iran's currency had plunged, its oil sector was under severe stress, and the current regime could not deliver the future that the Iranian people deserve. He argued that the public deserves what he called a new era, beyond corruption and disorder, under the Islamic Republic. The message was not subtle. It was pressure aimed not only at Tehran's state finances, but at the regime's political legitimacy. Bessent's statement came amid claims that an American maritime blockade had now lasted for more than 2 weeks. So, shipping data cited in the report suggested that the pressure campaign led to a sharp decline in Iranian oil exports. Analysts at Kepler said they had not observed any Iranian oil tankers leaving the Gulf of Oman since the blockade began, a data point that, if sustained, would represent an extraordinary disruption to Iran's most important revenue stream. American officials said on Wednesday that the sanctions and maritime restrictions were preventing the Iranian government from securing needed revenue from crude exports. The United States Central Command also said the military had successfully carried out a blockade lasting more than 2 weeks, sharply reducing trade with Iran. According to the figures cited, 41 tankers carrying a combined total of 69 million barrels of unsold oil were immobilized, producing losses estimated at more than $6 billion for the Iranian regime. Then on Thursday, Central Command updated those figures again, saying that a total of 44 ships had turned back under American orders. The exact long-term effect will depend on enforcement, insurance risk, buyer behavior, and storage capacity. But the immediate logic is clear. If Iran cannot move oil, it cannot easily stabilize its currency, fund imports, or support the wider network of activities that depend on petroleum revenue. The Iranian Rial, according to the report, fell to a record low against the United States dollar on Wednesday, underscoring the financial stress now facing an economy that remains heavily dependent on oil. One analyst, Johannes Rabe of Kepler, said Iran may be forced to begin cutting production within 1 to 2 weeks if storage space becomes insufficient. That is not a symbolic problem. That is a physical constraint. And physical constraints often drive political decisions faster than diplomatic statements do. Here is what matters for the broader region. A state under military threat can sometimes absorb symbolic sanctions. A state under military threat can export paralysis, faces a much harder equation. Currency weakness raises import costs, export disruption starves the treasury, and uncertainty increases the risk of internal fragmentation. When American officials pair that pressure with rhetoric about a new era for the Iranian people, Tehran is likely to hear not merely sanctions, but regime change signaling. Whether Washington intends that outcome or is merely using the language of maximum pressure remains an open question. But in strategic communication, ambiguity can itself be a tool. If Iranian leaders believe the United States is willing to move from containment to political rollback, the deterrent message becomes sharper. At the same time, so does the incentive for Tehran to preserve every buried missile, every concealed drone, and every remaining channel of leverage. The next front in this briefing is alliance politics, and it is no less consequential. President Trump said on Thursday, April 30th, that he may consider withdrawing some American troops from Spain and Italy, largely because those countries did not support the 2-month war involving the United States, Israel, and Iran. Just one day earlier, he had also said he was considering reducing the American military presence in Germany and would soon make a final decision. When asked whether similar measures might be applied to Spain and Italy, Trump answered with a question of his own: why should he not do so? He said Italy had not helped at all, and he described Spain's position as very poor and unacceptable. This is more than irritation. It reflects a recurring pattern in Trump's approach to alliances, where military commitments are treated not as fixed architecture, but as assets to be reweighted according to perceived loyalty and burden sharing. According to Pentagon figures cited in the report, as of December 2025, the United States had 12,662 active duty personnel stationed in Italy and 3,814 in Spain. Italy ranked fourth among the 5 countries hosting the largest concentrations of American troops after Japan, Germany, and South Korea. Those numbers matter because troop deployments are not abstract. They shape logistics, deterrence, intelligence sharing, and the political meaning of alliance solidarity. The warning directed at Berlin appears to have been linked to remarks by German Chancellor Friedrich Merz on April 27. According to the transcript, Merz said Iran was humiliating the United States and suggested that Iranian negotiators were highly skilled at avoiding meaningful talks, leaving American officials empty-handed after a trip to Islamabad. Whatever the exact context, the White House clearly viewed those comments as interference or criticism at a moment when it wanted Allied alignment. Trump later said the German chancellor should spend more time trying to end the war between Russia and Ukraine and dealing with domestic problems such as immigration and energy, rather than intruding into American efforts to remove the Iranian effort. Nuclear threat. That exchange reveals something larger than a personal dispute. It shows how the Iran question is now bleeding into debates over European security, transatlantic trust, and the future structure of the American military presence on the continent. This is not a small issue. For decades, American troops in Europe represented a relatively stable pillar of United States grand strategy. But if deployments become openly transactional, then every disagreement on the Middle East, Russia, trade, or defense spending can potentially affect the map of military presence. That would force European governments to recalculate far more than public rhetoric. It would force them to reconsider the durability of deterrence itself. Now let us move to Beijing, because another strategic narrative is being tested there as well. The Council on Foreign Relations published an analysis arguing that China's much-discussed de-dollarization drive is, in important ways, more cosmetic than transformative. On paper, China has reduced the share of dollars in its foreign exchange reserves. In practice, however, the role of the dollar inside the broader state financial system remains extremely large. The official figures are straightforward. In 2005, about 79% of China's reserves were reportedly held in dollars. By 2019, that published share had fallen to about 55%. At first glance, that looks like a major strategic shift away from the American currency, but the deeper picture is more complicated. The sharpest decline in the dollar share happened during the years when China's total foreign exchange reserves were rising dramatically, from roughly $800 billion to more than 3% trillion dollars. In other words, even as the percentage fell, the absolute amount of dollar exposure still increased substantially. That is not de-dollarization in the full sense. That is portfolio expansion with partial diversification. After 2014, China's reserves largely stopped growing and remained around the level of more than $3 trillion for years. As a result, later changes in the official share of dollar holdings had much less significance for global markets. The more important shift appears to have taken place off the main balance sheet. Rather than abandoning dollar assets, China appears to have redistributed them into other state-linked channels. Those channels reportedly include policy banks making overseas loans, state-owned commercial banks, and sovereign investment funds. Available data, while incomplete, indicate that much of the international lending conducted by Chinese policy banks is still denominated in dollars. Debt restructurings in countries such as Zambia, Sri Lanka, and Ecuador have also primarily involved dollar debt rather than renminbi debt. State commercial banks are also believed to hold large amounts of dollar assets. One estimate in the report put roughly 70% of their foreign currency assets in dollars. At the same time, some of these banks have borrowed in other currencies, such as euros and yen, while continuing to increase dollar assets. That suggests the domestic system is still supplying support for dollar-based investment, even as the public narrative emphasizes reduced dependence. If all of those channels are added together, the picture becomes clearer. The report suggested that around $1.8 trillion of official reserves may still be dollar denominated. More than $1 trillion in dollar assets may sit with state commercial banks. Another amount approaching $1 trillion could be held through policy banks, while a large share of sovereign investment abroad is also believed to remain tied to the dollar. The conclusion is difficult to avoid. China may have moved dollars out of the official reserve ledger without reducing the broader system's reliance on the dollar itself. That is not propaganda. It is an accounting and institutional question. If the same state still controls the assets through different vehicles, then the strategic dependence has been rearranged more than removed. Why does this matter right now? Because Washington and Beijing are once again entering a high-level diplomatic phase, and economic signaling is central to that process. A state that still relies heavily on dollar channels has incentives to challenge the existing order rhetorically while remaining cautious operationally. It may want a more multipolar financial system in the long term, but it cannot simply walk away from the infrastructure of the current one. That tension was visible again on Thursday, April 30th, when Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent confirmed that he had spoken with Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng. According to Bessent, the conversation addressed issues related to President Trump's upcoming trip to China in May, and he described the exchange as frank and comprehensive. He also said he had stressed that China's recent extraterritorial control measures were having negative effects on global supply chains. Chinese state broadcaster CCTV reported the call as well, saying that He Lifeng held a video conversation with Bessent and with the United States Trade Representative, identified in the transcript as Jameson Greer. The Chinese side said both countries had engaged in frank, in-depth, and constructive exchanges on economic and trade issues of common concern and on expanding practical cooperation. The contrast in tone is notable. Washington highlighted coercive spillover into supply chains. Beijing highlighted constructive engagement. The timing makes the call especially significant. President Trump is expected to visit China in mid-May and meet President Xi Jinping. That means both sides are now shaping the diplomatic atmosphere in advance, and neither side wants to enter the summit appearing weak. Public criticism before a meeting can therefore serve a dual purpose. It pressures the other side, while also reassuring domestic audiences that no concession is being made for free. Bessent's comments also broke what the report described as near total silence from the Trump administration regarding China's new supply chain regulations. In recent weeks, Beijing has introduced rules that provide a legal basis for punishing foreign firms attempting to shift purchases of critical minerals and strategic goods away from China. For many companies, that creates a new layer of compliance risk. It is no longer just a commercial issue, it is becoming a legal and geopolitical one. Washington, for its part, has been building its own pressure points. In response to Chinese restrictions on the export of critical minerals such as rare earth magnets, the United States has advanced measures involving data controls, technology restrictions, and visa regulation affecting Chinese students. According to comments Besson reportedly made in an earlier interview, the United States still holds leverage in sectors such as engines, aircraft, silicon, and educational access. He also drew a broader ideological contrast. The United States, he said, helped establish institutions such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund as instruments of soft power, while China seeks not merely to participate in global institutions, but ultimately to control them. He contrasted that with Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, describing China's methods as oriented more toward hard power than partnership. That framing is not neutral, but it reveals how the current administration sees the contest. This is not simply a tariff dispute or a disagreement over one shipment of rare earths. It is a struggle over who sets the rules of interdependence. If one side controls the minerals, the processing, the legal choke points, and the shipping base, while the other controls the financial architecture, technology stack, and access to high-end systems, then both sides possess leverage and both sides remain vulnerable. According to the report, the call between Besson and He Lifeng marked the first public exchange between top Chinese and American economic officials since the beginning of the latest American and Israeli attacks on Iran. Xinhua also said Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi spoke by phone with Secretary of State Marco Rubio on Thursday, though Washington had not yet commented publicly on that contact. This suggests that the Iran crisis is already interacting with the broader United States-China agenda, whether through energy markets, diplomatic posture, or strategic signaling. That brings us to Russia, where the energy consequences of war are again becoming visible in hard production data. Bloomberg, citing data from CDU-TEC, reported that Russia's refinery throughput has fallen to its lowest level since 2009. The decline follows repeated Ukrainian drone attacks on refineries, oil storage depots, and pipeline infrastructure stretching from the Leningrad region to the Ural Mountains. Russian refinery output reportedly fell to about 4.69 million barrels per day compared with the start of the year. That was down 11%. Compared with the same period 1 year earlier, it was down 12%. And compared with 2021, before the full-scale war, it was down 18%, or nearly 1 million barrels per day. In April alone, Bloomberg said Ukrainian forces struck Russian oil infrastructure at least 21 times. That figure reportedly set a record for the beginning of the year and ranked among the highest monthly totals since the war began. At least 9 refineries were reportedly hit by drones in April, and 5 of them halted production either fully or partially. At least 5 attacks targeted Russia's pipeline network, one of the world's longest and a system whose strategic roots go back to the Cold War. Offshore energy infrastructure was also hit 6 times, including at Baltic export nodes where a substantial share of Russian oil moves outward. Ports such as Primorsk and UST Luga on the Baltic reportedly suspended oil shipments in April before later resuming exports. Novorossiysk also halted operations, and toward the end of the month the Tuapse terminal, a Rosneft export hub for petroleum products, was reportedly attacked as well. In addition, Bloomberg's calculation indicated that 1 tanker was struck by a drone in April, on top of 3 more incidents in March. The cumulative result has been a steep drop in refinery utilization. According to the report, that rate has now fallen below even the level reached during the peak of the domestic gasoline crisis last autumn, when throughput was about 4.8 million barrels per day. At that earlier stage, fuel shortages emerged inside Russia. Regional filling stations had to return to ration-like distribution practices, and gasoline prices reached record highs. This is the real significance of the Ukrainian drone campaign. It is not only about destroying assets, it is about imposing friction across the Russian energy chain. Extraction, transport, refining, export, and domestic distribution. When enough disruptions accumulate, the state faces a difficult trade-off between earning export revenue and keeping internal fuel markets stable. In a long war, that trade-off becomes strategic. Our final major development tonight comes from North Korea, where state intervention is once again disrupting the very trade channels Pyongyang says it wants to expand. According to Daily NK, authorities are forcing coastal aquaculture operations in South Hamgyong province to cut ties with their current Chinese partners and switch instead to partners designated by the state. The result has reportedly been cancelled agreements, broken expectations, and growing losses for local workers and managers. In places such as Jingpyeong County and nearby areas, aquaculture facilities were ordered to sever relations with existing Chinese investors, even when those investors had already provided capital and fish stock. Facilities that had accepted outside funding were still told to hand over their operations and production quotas to new partners. The people who originally arranged the cooperation were then left looking as though they had broken their word. Some fish farms were even reassigned to entirely different units. Compensation for the displaced Chinese investors appears to have been left unresolved. According to the report, the authorities offered no clear guidance and shifted responsibility down to individual facilities, forcing workers and managers to deal with the fallout on their own. Previously, investors expected to recover their capital through future harvest output. Now, however, some facilities are reportedly being compelled to transfer all output to newly assigned partners, while also taking responsibility for compensating the original investors. In the best-case scenario, a new partner may repay the initial investment, but that is far from guaranteed, and the legal basis for any protection appears weak. The same pattern reportedly extends beyond aquaculture into exports of medicinal herbs and wild vegetables, both of which are valuable sources of foreign currency. According to the source cited, business agreements in North Korea are increasingly shaped by political hierarchy rather than economic efficiency or pre-existing relationships. Local enterprises are told to attract investment, yet once production is secured, that production can be redirected to politically favored counterparts. The reputational damage is immediate. Some Chinese partners have already stopped cooperating or cut communication entirely. Others reportedly believe that the concept of a binding contract does not meaningfully exist in dealings with North Korea if state intervention can override any arrangement at will. With little room to resist official interference, most partners seem to be choosing the same course: limit losses, recover what capital they can, and withdraw. That matters because North Korea remains dependent on Chinese trade, investment, and access to foreign currency. If unilateral cancellations continue, confidence among Chinese counterparties may erode further, undermining precisely the external flows Pyongyang needs in order to stabilize local production and broaden commerce with China. In other words, the state may be asserting control in the short term while weakening its own economic base in the longer term. When you place all of these stories side by side, a broader picture emerges. The United States is combining military planning, sanctions, pressure, and alliance signaling in ways that blur the line between deterrence and coercive restructuring. Iran is trying to survive under that pressure by preserving hidden capabilities and riding out economic punishment. So China is still deeply embedded in the dollar system, even as it talks about reducing dependence on it. and Washington is challenging Beijing. At the same time, it prepares for another summit. Russia's refinery network is absorbing the cumulative cost of drone warfare, while North Korea is damaging investor confidence through command politics. So the unasked question is not whether the world is unstable. That part is obvious. The harder question is whether the major powers still have credible mechanisms for limiting escalation once pressure campaigns begin to overlap. In the Middle East, in Europe, in East Asia, and across energy markets, the systems that once separated one crisis from another are starting to weaken. That is why tonight's developments should not be read as isolated updates. They are connected pieces of a larger strategic moment, one in which logistics, currencies, shipping lanes, military deployments, and diplomatic theater are all being used as instruments of power. The language may remain measured for now. The structure underneath it is becoming far more severe, and that is where we will leave it tonight. Watch the Strait of Hormuz, watch the tanker traffic, watch the currency markets, watch the troop signals in Europe, and watch the tone coming out of Washington and Beijing before the next leader-level meeting. Because in periods like this, the next major shift often appears first, not in a formal declaration, but in the movement of ships, aircraft, money, and silence.